So just exactly what can we expect? A court-martial or what? We'll talk about that tonight with a return guest, military defense attorney and former Navy JAG officer Brian Bouffard. Good evening, Brian.
Good evening. Happy New Year, Jim.
Happy New Year to you, and good to have you on tonight. I know that the Army has prosecuted about 1,900 cases of desertion since 2001, so that's now 14 years starting this new year. There were tens of thousands of soldiers who actually did flee the service in the face of this or that problem, from multiple deployments all the way to just the fact that the other people are shooting at me. But the Army, and then for that matter the military, rarely takes desertion cases to court. Your thoughts about this one?
Well, I think you've said it absolutely correctly. The overwhelming way that they usually charge cases where somebody is not where they're supposed to be is unauthorized absence, or also known as AWOL in the Army. And for it to escalate to desertion, the government would have to prove that the accused, when he or she left, had the intent to remain away permanently. So when we see cases, here, for example, here in the States, sometimes people just get tired of the military and don't want to serve out their contract, and instead of, sucking it up and keeping going, they run away. And there can, certainly be obvious reasons, even just domestic, issues at home, why somebody would just say, hey, I'm going to leave and not ever come back.
Yeah, I could just pack up and leave this job too,
Sure.
But I can't get sent to prison. There's a special measure when you sign on the dotted line with Uncle Sam. There is by the very necessity of defending your country, there are penalties involved with not doing so in the appropriate way or at the prescribed time.
Sure. Sure. There are certain offenses that are purely military offenses, and as you've said, desertion and unauthorized absence, they don't have any kind of counterpart in the civilian criminal law.
Yeah. Now, first of all, of course, the standard of proof that applies in this radio show is vastly different from what would apply in the case of a military court-martial, should it reach that level, which is essentially a military equivalent of a civilian court, and there are various assumptions of innocence and all the rest, right, which I'll talk about that with you a bit further here in a moment. But suffice it to say, for the purposes of this program, where hearsay and any number of things can enter into it simply because we, the two of us, or any listener, cannot do anything to Sergeant Bergdahl, so therefore the standard is a lot lower. We're discussing merely. Now, I have heard hearsay that, in fact, members of his unit indicate he left a note, sort of a goodbye note. He packed up certain items and left other items, and that according to what I have heard from those other members in that unit or about them, there ain't much doubt about the fact that this was adios permanently.
Right, and I've heard those same things, and that note and that testimony is something that the government is certainly going to want to present if they go forward with a desertion case, and if that case, ends up in trial, because they could certainly charge him, and he could make the decision to plead guilty if he chose to do so.
So you have to wonder, and we might as well bring it out now because it's the elephant in the room, and that is, given the fact that Bergdahl was swapped for 5 members of the Taliban, in and of itself a controversial decision, in and of itself one with some partisan overtones, and in and of itself the fact that this all took place in an election year, there have been the view of many, and certainly that would include me, to think that very possibly we are talking here about politics, and that it would be inconvenient for the administration to admit that they not only paid a high price in terms of 5 Taliban commanders for an ordinary grunt, but maybe an ordinary grunt who was possibly a deserter, that this would reflect rather badly on the administration. And so I must confess, until I hear to the contrary, convincingly, it will certainly be in the back of my mind that the reason we have not seen charges pursued against Bo Bergdahl is that the administration would feel embarrassed. I'm just curious your thoughts about that.
I think that's very possible. I think that's extremely possible, particularly when you take into account kind of the way that this swap was done. It's kind of an open question to me, as sad as this sounds, it's an open question to me whether or not the president knew that back in 2009, they had enough evidence to very strongly suggest that Sergeant Bergdahl had done this of his own free will.
Now, I know that the President's got a lot of stuff on his plate, and Commander-in-Chief's only part of that. But,
right.
but still, on a case of this seriousness in which you have an American who's missing in Afghanistan, there aren't that many of them, you would think that at some point in some of his briefings it would have been mentioned, all of these details, that while we have yet to make this or that, whatever determination, but the accusations from his unit are, it's awfully hard to believe that at some point that was not explained to the President. I'll put it this way. I would not want to have been the presidential briefer who overlooked mentioning that. Sure,
I totally agree with you. It almost strains credibility to assume that he wasn't properly briefed. And, you know, at that point, you know, if you assume that he was properly briefed, then we just have an open debate on the issue of even service members who appear to have done wrong, do we still owe them any kind of obligation to bring them back home? And if they need to face justice, let them face actual justice and not just brutality from a very brutal enemy.
And as we go to the break here, we will not spend all night on this aspect of the case, but quite frankly, had Bo Bergdahl been a hero, and we have, as I understand it, zero evidence to indicate that. At best, he was just another guy who did his duty, and probably not even that. But even assuming that to be the case, I'm sorry, but from a purely pragmatic point of view, this was not a very good player trade.
You know, again, it's hard to know. There's so much about this case that just nobody knows, and I'm hoping that when they release that investigation, we're all going to get a lot of answers.
Absolutely. We'll come back and we'll talk some more about the issues involved here and some of the precise definitions. It could very well be that my non-legal decades-old memory is not perfect on the subject of desertions and absent without leave and all the rest. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. And let us be the first in this new year to say Bo Bergdahl, because I can assure you we will not be the last. Back in just a moment. Our guest, Brian Bouffard, began his career in Texas as a case investigator for Child Protective Services. After graduating law school, he joined the Navy Judge Advocate General Corps. He served 5 years on active duty as the only Navy officer in a Marine Corps legal detachment. Following a stint as an assistant criminal DA in the Fort Worth, Texas area, he opened his own firm, JAGDefender.com, acting as a civilian counsel defending service members in all branches of our armed forces throughout the U.S. and across the globe. We're talking, of course, about the Bo Bergdahl unresolved case despite all this time, but it is, of course, after the election. So the president has been liberated by the results of November to shall we say, do whatever is necessary as opposed to worrying about an electorate that has already turned on him. Let's talk to Helene in Inglewood, Florida. Good evening, Helene. Happy New Year.
Hey, Happy New Year to both of you. Excuse my ignorance about this because, you know, it's not something that you hear a lot about. So to your guest, how many other cases of desertion, how were other cases of desertion prior to this one treated in the past, prior to this case? What did they do with desertion prior to this case?
Did you ever see the TV movie The Execution of Eddie Slovic?
No, I'm sorry, I did not.
The title pretty much tells you what happened in that particular case, in which a U.S. soldier in World War II was in fact lined up in front of a firing squad and executed. As I understand it, then the commander of U.S. forces, well, all of Allied forces in Western Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, was rather sickened by the whole process. Brian, care to jump in here on how we handle such cases?
Sure. Happy New Year, Helene. Essentially, desertion cases, you know, the vast majority of them occur just here in the United States, here in garrison and not necessarily in a war zone. And I'm not going to say that they're ignored by any stretch, but they just tend to end up in a fairly no fuss, no muss, getting someone out of the military with what they refer to as bad paper, either a dishonorable discharge or an other than honorable discharge. But typically you don't see a ton of confinement in a case like that as part of the punishment. Again, this case may be very, very different just because it's a fairly unique set of facts.
Yeah, they are different. Of course, this was not a stateside desertion. This was, of course,
Right.
a combat zone, Helene. So, the idea that he would be executed, I mean, there's not a chance in a million that would happen. But the rest of his life behind bars, I suppose, Brian, that's at least possible, isn't it?
In theory, it is. Under these circumstances, which would be if they do charge him with desertion. It's clearly in a time of war, and those two facts alone, if there's a conviction, the punishment can literally range from a sentence of no punishment, basically letting the conviction itself serve as the punishment, all the way up to the death penalty. So realistically, no, there's no way they're going to refer this as a capital case, but it does underscore the fact that really everything else is open to the sentencing authority.
Mm.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you for your call. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. I note, as I read your experience in which you served actually as civilian counsel defending service members in branches of the armed forces. For most of us, of course, the closest we'll get to a military court-martial would be the Jack Nicholson, Tom Cruise movie, A Few Good Men.
Right.
Regardless of the theatrics that were necessarily employed in that movie, I'm curious how well it stands as a documentary, even though, of course, it was not meant to be. Was that a fairly accurate portrayal, histrionics aside, of military courtroom procedure?
I would say it was certainly written for entertainment, so it probably bears the same resemblance to a court-martial as, say, an episode of Law and Order would bear to a civilian court.
Which I've had some lawyers tell me it wasn't necessarily that far off.
Well, it's not necessarily that far off. There are certain, aspects of examining witnesses and things that go on actually in the trial that I thought were pretty accurate. But, for example, they convicted those two Marines in the movie, and without any kind of sentencing hearing or hearing any evidence in extenuation and mitigation, they just roll right into a sentence, and that would never occur.
Yeah, I must confess I wondered about that myself. And for those who feel that the term military justice is an oxymoron, that's not true at all. In point of fact, in some ways, I've been told, unfortunately in my time in the military I never found out firsthand, but I've been told that in some ways the protections afforded a defendant in a military court may exceed those in civilian court, on top of which you have a jury in a military court where if you order someone to ignore a certain piece of evidence, they are used to taking orders and they will ignore it.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said. F. Lee Bailey, who I'm sure your listeners will remember as a famous lawyer, he was on the O.J. Simpson case and such. He's a former Marine, and he was asked that question and gave an answer that I agree with completely, and that is, he said that if I had an innocent client, I want to be in front of a military court-martial. If I have a guilty client that I'm just trying to get acquitted, I'd rather try that case in front of a civilian jury. And for basically the reasons you mentioned, and plus military juries tend to be far better educated than civilian juries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you serve on a military court-martial, if I'm not mistaken, on a military case, are not all the members of the jury of equal or superior rank, which would mean, of course, in the case of many people that they know something about the military, and you don't get promoted in the military these days without having a pretty fair amount of smarts.
Well, I wish that were completely true, but it is mostly true.
All right.
But yes, if you're an officer and you're an accused in a court-martial, you're going to be tried by a panel of all officers.
Right.
If you're an enlisted person like Sergeant Bergdahl is, he may elect for a panel of all officers, or he may elect a panel of officers with at least 1/3 enlisted representation, and those would also be senior to him. So you're not tried by your peers, you're tried by your seniors.
Yeah. Let's take a call from Dave in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Good evening, Dave.
Hey, Jim. Good evening, sir. Good evening to you. Happy New Year, gentlemen.
Happy New Year.
I've been in the Guard for 15 years. I served in Afghanistan from March of 11 to March of 12.
And thank you for your service, by the way.
I appreciate that. It was unfathomable to us, to any of us, during our time to just simply leave the wire and disappear. You know, it's one thing, I've seen a lot of AWOLs throughout my career back home in Garrison and even in some of the U.S. bases, OCONUS. But I just, I don't understand how it could be treated as anything other than a desertion versus, I mean, AWOL is deserting too, but we're talking in a combat zone. The guy had to know. It still irks me how anybody can even doubt whether or not the guy intended to just leave for a little bit, or...
I mean, and do what? You know, I mean, we're going to want to hitchhike through Taliban territory and catch an Air Pakistan flight? I mean, what? I mean, it wasn't exactly well thought out.
Jim, there's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
I was in Kabul, which is the capital, okay?
Yeah.
It's at least kind of civilization. I mean, if you want to call it that. This guy was in a cop or a fob somewhere. There's nowhere to go. There's absolutely nowhere to go. What is it they think that he thinks he was doing?
Yeah.
It was simply just going to disappear. And I don't know. You know, it sickens me, too, to think that there are guys here who get a break because, you know, they're OCONUS, they disappear for 30 days, and they come back, they get cut a general discharge under honorable or other non-honorable conditions. Yeah. And this guy who may cut the same break in having deserted in theater. And he got snatched up, and good for him. He got what was coming to him. But that's a whole other thing. Yeah.
Now, hold on to the line, if you would, just a second, Dave. We're coming up on a break that doesn't move, but I want you to conclude your thoughts and have some response from Brian Bouffard when we come back in just a moment on the Jim Bohannon Show, 1-866-50-JIMBO. Brian Bouffard, again, a former JAG officer, and served in the Navy for 5 years, acted for a while as a civilian counsel defending service members in all branches of our armed forces. His website, jagdefender.com. And Dave, who called in from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a listener, I'm guessing, of WRKO in Boston, and himself a veteran of the Afghanistan conflict, who had some strong views. Dave, I wanted you to finish your thoughts about Bo Bergdahl and the circumstances over there, and then I'd like Brian to respond.
Thanks, Jim. I didn't mean to ramble, but
you did not ramble at all. We just have a clock that doesn't make any concessions, so go right ahead.
No worries. Hey, the thought I was driving at, you know, if we're talking World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Joe sneaks out to trade for some booze or go to a cat house or something. Yeah, okay, I kind of get that. Bo Bergdahl had no place to go. There are no cat houses in Afghanistan. There's no place for us to go. There's, you know, if you're going to get booze, you're going to trade it with the coalition guys like the French or the Bulgarians or other coalition folks that could have it. If you're on a cop or a fob out in the middle of nowhere and you decide to just walk off the job, so to speak, well, your intent is to disappear. It's not to just simply leave and come back. The thing that has me kind of concerned about this whole thing, and I know you're driving at the administration worrying about being embarrassed because they traded 5 Taliban commanders for this guy. How much can the administration actually weigh in on a military proceeding for a wartime desertion like this, if they can at all?
That's a really good question that Dave poses, Brian. Granted, the president is the commander-in-chief always and forevermore, but still, I would think that there must be some procedures here that are fairly well spelled out that are not at the discretion of the chain of command, even the top of the chain of command.
Well, to Dave's first point, I see this case, you know, based on what I know, I see this exactly the same way that he does. You know, if you're stationed at Camp Pendleton and you're from Kansas City and you decide you don't want to be there and you don't want to play anymore, and you run away and you go back to your home in Kansas City and get a job and start your life, yeah, you've deserted. And we can't condone running out like that, but at least we can understand it. You're going home, you're taking care of your kids and your obligations and such as that. But yeah, Sergeant Bergdahl was at a FOB, a forward operating base, and Dave is right. There's no place for him to go, and that the inference that he intended to stay away permanently is going to be a very difficult thing for the defense to try to overcome if they do charge him with desertion.
Yeah, it just it does seem that this will be a difficult one to explain away, I would think, Dave.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then to Dave's second point, you know, the interplay of politics in the military justice system is actually something that's you know, in the news these days a lot in the sexual assault context. But I can tell you that, you know, typically when a convening authority, that is a flag officer or general officer who is in charge of convening the court-martial, if he or she believes that it's appropriate, higher authority can't tell them what to do or how to do that. If they do, for example, if a convening authority says, well, I'm not going to send this to a court-martial, I don't think it deserves to be there, a higher person should not be able to come in and say, well, I'm going to take that away from you. You're doing it incorrectly, and I want it to be handled in a more harsh way. That could be unlawful command influence. But if the president doesn't want the case to go to trial, it's not going to go to trial.
Yeah, I mean, I can easily see that. I mean, regardless of what the rules and regs may say, let's face it, if you're a three-star general and there aren't that many slots at four-star, and you can hint rather strongly that, well, we only have a short list of who makes that fourth star, if you get my drift. I mean, you don't have to exactly telegraph that. At that stage of the game, promotions are so completely within the discretion of higher authority, and at that level you don't get very many authorities beyond that before you're at the presidential level, that these people are very susceptible to career blackmail, if you will.
Well, they absolutely are, and we've seen it a lot in the sexual assault context that has been going on for the past couple of years, particularly in the Marine Corps. You know, I don't want to indict all general officers or paint them with the, you know, the same brush, but the fact of the matter is that this role of the convening authority in the military justice system requires a great deal of moral courage, and it requires the ability to kind of step out of the careerist mode and say, whatever, you know, wherever the chips fall, we need to do the right thing. And if this case does not deserve to go to trial, I'm not going to put this young man through that.
1-866-50-JIMBO. Anything else, Dave?
No, sir. I'm just arriving at work, so thank you very much. You guys have a good night, and thanks again.
You bet. We
Happy
will.
New Year, Dave.
And thank you for your service, Dave. We really do appreciate it very much. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll talk some more about the whole notion here of what constitutes desertion and either the possible or the likely courses of action which might be taken in the case of Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Back in a moment. We're talking about the case of Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who wandered away from his unit in Afghanistan. Of that, there seems to be no dispute, whatever his motivation may have been. Some reports painted in rather clear terms that it was an act of desertion, but that, of course, will await ultimately a court-martial or perhaps even before that a determination, quite frankly, from General Mark Milley, the commander of U.S. Forces Command. We're talking about it with former Navy JAG officer Brian Bouffard. I'm wondering about the discretion at the hands of General Milley here. Is it totally within his authority to say we proceed with a court-martial or we do not, or are there certain rules of evidence or what have you that would force him in one direction or another?
He's not going to be necessarily forced in a particular direction. He's going to receive briefings from his staff judge advocate, essentially his counsel, and the trial counsel, which is the military term for prosecutor. And they're going to sit down with him and explain, you know, here's what we think happened. Here's the evidence that points our way. Hopefully they will have a conversation about any evidence that points, you know, away from guilt. And once all that is laid before General Milley, he will take it all under advisement. And if there's a general court-martial contemplated, there'll be a full Article 32 investigation, which is more or less an adversarial hearing, kind of like a preliminary hearing, and that would also be summed up in a report. So he'll have all that information before deciding what to do. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing that fetters his discretion. He can do all the way from no action at all to a general court-martial with a capital referral, hypothetically.
Hypothetically. All right. In terms of the length of time that this has taken, the capture of Sergeant Bergdahl occurred in 2009, what is now in this calendar year 6 years ago, over 5 certainly, and we go back to last May, over half a year since he was swapped back to his freedom, and he's been sitting there in this legal limbo. Again, he hasn't, we're told, collected his back pay of about $200,000. He's got a desk job in San Antonio. It sounds as though, well, like he's a hot potato and somebody somewhere does not know exactly what to do with him.
Well, that could be. And you know, again, it's sad to contemplate this, but from a realistic perspective, we did have midterm elections, and this is the kind of thing that again is, like you said, a political hot potato as well. So there could have been all sorts of reasons why this thing was delayed. One of those reasons, of course, is there's just a lot of moving parts. It's an overseas incident. There's a lot of witnesses to talk to. But did it seem odd to me that it took this long? Yeah, it really did.
We have a call from Tom in Claymont, Delaware on the Jim Bohannon Show. Good evening, Tom.
Hi, Jim. Nice show. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Tom.
When he, part of his unit were on the news, and they said when he first deserted, they lost men when they were looking for him. Shouldn't he be held accountable for some of that? If they find out that it was a desertion case?
One would certainly think so, if in fact that is the case. I heard that as well, but again, of course, it falls under that area of hearsay. Reports indicate that such and such occurred. I think that accusation has been made, but let's assume that we had ironclad evidence that A, he deserted, and B, that soldiers sent out specifically to look for Bergdahl were in fact killed in combat. To what extent could that be therefore leveled at Sergeant Bergdahl?
Well, realistically, that is the kind of thing that would come into play in a sentencing hearing, assuming, as you say, that there's ironclad evidence. They've taken him to a general court-martial. He's been convicted, and now, you know, we're going to have that sentencing hearing that they did not do in A Few Good Men. And the purpose of a sentencing hearing, once a conviction has been reached, the purpose of a sentencing hearing is to determine what is the appropriate response, punishment-wise, to this accused. And so the government's job is to present aggravating evidence tending to show that he should be punished harshly. It's the defense's job to produce evidence in extenuation and mitigation to show why he should be punished more leniently. And the fact finder will hear both of those presentations and then argument and then reach their sentence. But to the caller's point, I heard that too. I heard that there were people who went looking for him that were injured and in some cases killed, and that is precisely the kind of aggravating evidence that the government can and should put in a case like this.
Yeah. Anything else, Tom?
Yeah, that's all I wanted. That's all I wanted to know. Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you for your call. You bet, and thank you very much. Yeah, that would certainly, I would think, be an extremely aggravating case. If you could, since you're obviously conversant through your various jobs with both ends of this equation, how does military law differ from civilian law? In obviously a broad picture here, there are many areas of minutia and many different local laws, but in general, what's the difference between military justice and civilian justice?
Well, I think one of the big differences, particularly in this case, is there are offenses in the military that certainly have civilian analogs, like, you know, rape and murder and robbery and things like that. Those are crimes under the UCMJ.
Uniform Code of Military Justice, for those who don't know.
Correct. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the statutes created by Congress to run the military justice system. And so that's one of the differences is the military also has crimes that have no civilian counterpart. Like, for example, unauthorized absence. If you don't show up to your job, you can certainly be fired, but you're not going to go to jail. And the military is certainly different. There are other issues. For example, adultery is a crime that is punishable by conviction and confinement under the UCMJ, and it's not the case in civilian jurisdictions. So that's one of those differences is military-specific offenses. Some of the other differences, just basically comprise the pretrial process and how a case gets to trial. But once you're in trial, it really looks very similar to what you might see in many civilian courtrooms.
Well, Brian Bouffard is our guest, civilian counsel for defense purposes, also a civilian prosecutor in the Fort Worth, Texas area, and a former Navy JAG officer. I am curious, by the way, as serving on active duty as the only Navy officer in a Marine Corps legal detachment, just how serious are those rivalries?
I found there to be no rivalry at all. I mean, there's some good-natured ribbing kind of back and forth, squid versus jarhead, but the Marines that I met and still know to this day, I mean, they're the best friends I'll ever have in my life.
Fair enough. Now, the way in which this is being handled, of course, laws are passed not just to mete out appropriate punishment, although that is one reason, but they are passed, if they're legitimately passed, with the idea of shaping behavior. For example, we will fine you, possibly, depending on the circumstances, even incarcerate you if you run a traffic light. The idea is not just that you deserve punishment for risking people's lives, but we also wish to send a message to other people, because let's face it, if in fact people had to be prosecuted to get them to obey traffic signals, then our streets would be a jungle. The whole point is to deter certain behavior. Now then, how the Bergdahl case to date and how other possible desertion cases to date have been handled, what message does that send to maybe the more marginal members of our U.S. Armed Forces?
Well, I think any time that there's a crime that's publicized and that's responded to harshly, I think it certainly does, at least send a message to whoever's willing to listen that certain things, either are or are not taken seriously. In a case like this, though, I mean, again, everything about Bergdahl, I don't want to use the word unique, but it's certainly very rare for the reason that our second caller, pointed out. Leaving from a forward operating base deep in Taliban territory is just not something that you see people doing very much. So I think anybody probably in the position where they might be deterred by Sergeant Bergdahl, hopefully they're probably not thinking about doing anything that stupid anyway.
One would certainly hope that that was in fact the case. If you could change the way the military handles such accusations, what would you change?
Such accusations, meaning desertion?
As a serious case like desertion, something that can seriously impact the morale of units in a combat situation. If you could change the way the military handles cases like this in terms of how much discretion to give to individual commanders or the potential punishments, how would you change the system, if at all?
To me, and I have to preface it by saying that I love the military justice system, and I do agree with what F. Lee Bailey said about it. That said, it's not perfect, and one of the ways that at least I, from a defense perspective, an individual rights perspective, the problem I have with it is that the convening authority, in addition to having the authority to determine whether a case is going to go to court-martial, he also has an authority that I think would make a lot of your listeners kind of do a double take, and that is he or she selects the panel of members who will be the pool of jurors to sit on a military court-martial. We call them members. So the convening authority personally selects members to hear a case, and presumably we're starting with a convening authority who, if the case is at a court-martial, he or she believes that the accused is guilty. And so it kind of sends a message where, you always have to wonder, is the convening authority trying to pack the court with like-minded people because he or she wants a particular result? I
would think that if the defense lost, that would always be the basis for an appeal. We've got about 20 seconds here.
Well, it would be if you can prove it. And that's another reason why I said, part of the one hallmark of a convening authority that they all have to have is moral courage, and that's what we need to see, and unfortunately we don't always see it.
Fair enough. Stay on the line. We'll speak off air. Again, we are talking with former Navy JAG officer Brian Bouffard, whose own firm is JAGDefender.com. He's acted as civilian counsel to members of the military over the years. We're talking about the Bo Bergdahl case, still unresolved. This is Westwood One.